everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wanda Corn. Tonight she will speak about her experience researching and organizing her traveling exhibition on George O'Keeffe with a talk entitled, very enticing, Artists, Homes, Studios, and Closets. Please welcome Dr. Wanda Corn.
Thank you. Now we have just a little bit of adjustments here because this is not my first picture. So we have to go back to the first picture and we have to get out my clicker. Thanks, Elizabeth. Don't give away the show. Don't look. Okay, there we go. All right, great. Okay, so my job is to keep you awake. And given the amount of wine that I've seen flowing, this could be a challenge. But I'll try. And let me just also say, there's all kinds of chairs up here, so if some of you, after you've had your pie, want to kind of wander up here to get a more front row seat or bring your chair up, please feel free to we'll keep this very informal and feel free to move closer to the screen. We do know that this is small pictures for a big topic. Anyway, I also just want to add my welcomes to everyone. These workshops always are impressive in terms of how much talent is in the room, and also the kinds of discussions and conversations that always get generated as we work together and play together over the next couple of days. It's like going to camp with people that you are very happy to come to know and learn more about your everyday worlds. And a special welcome to our visitors from across the pond to New England, or I think when we come to a place like Stockbridge, we like to say in the States, ye old New England. And that should resonate with you old Englanders as a phrase that we use quite often. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, not just about my show, but what happened in an artist's studio or two that made this show come to pass. This is really an origins story based on the kind of work that most of you in this room do. When I put this exhibition together, which is called Living Modern, it wasn't your usual O'Keeffe painting show, which is, we've had lots of them in this country, and I'm happy to say that Britain now has had a major show at Tate Modern. But what made it unusual was the inclusion of clothes, but also clothes, photographs of the artists wearing clothes, and paintings, such as the little trio, which is the sort of thesis statement that opened the exhibition in most of its venues. It's in Wichita, by the way, now. It's left Cleveland and just opened in Wichita a couple of weeks ago. It's in its fifth venue. And its success has been way beyond my, but also the Brooklyn Museum, the originating institution's expectations. For reasons I have to say that I could never have guessed. It has a youthful following. It also has a following from what I call the thread crowd, people who are interested in either making clothes or thinking about clothes or are into the history of fashion or textiles or whatever. But it's particularly the young generation that has found this so interesting because, as they tell me, and when they write their reviews or talk about it, it's all about curating the self. I should say curating the self. That's not my word, that's their word. Or giving yourself a brand. And for them, they see a more human artist emerging, and also see how that artist controlled, if you will, her environment and her self-presentation in ways that gave her a kind of consistency and a public identity based on those particular disciplines that she had in putting herself together. But what I want to talk to you about, and this is really what interested me in doing the show, was and I'll give you a few more examples where you can see the multimedia aspect of the exhibition. What I wanted to talk to you today is first a little bit of biography, how artist studios could be said to have led to this project, and then also to encourage all of you to know that what you work so hard in preserving, at least in this case, led one art historian to make new and discoveries about an artist. I am one of the few here who's not a worker bee in running an artist property. I'm an academic art historian, but I have long believed that artists' homes and studios present a wealth of information and evidence that my peers, that is other academic art historians and scholars, either underuse or worse, don't use at all, or even worse than that, mistrust. So that's one thing I want to talk a little bit about. And then more importantly, I want to give you a case study of how I was able to use the material culture to be found in an artist property to not only learn more about an artist's life or in an artist's studio practices, and you can always learn something of an artist's lifestyle in one of these homes, but also, and this is what really interests me, the aesthetics and particulars of the very works of art that come out of those spaces. To some degree, I know I am talking to the choir. You all know the depth of evidence that material culture offers to anyone writing history of your artists. But in this country, and it'll be interesting to hear our British colleagues' discourse on this, art historians are still very text-based, and they will turn to paper archives, newspapers, diaries, archives that are in major repositories like the Archives of American Art, long before they'll go to, let's call it, things. I'm going to begin my story tonight. There were a couple of possibilities, but given that I have two studios, both have strong representation here at the conference. But about 40 years ago, in 1980, more or less, I saw for the first time this studio, Grant Wood's loft studio in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I was at the time studying the work of Grant Wood, the artist, and for those of you who might not know his key piece, you do because you've just seen it in London for the Brits. There it is, the couple with the pitchfork. But in any case, Grant Wood, this is back in 1980, he was somewhat persona non grata as a regionalist artist of the 1930s, and I was putting together a modern day exhibition, and I was trying to do some oral history with people in Cedar Rapids where he lived for a good part of his life, who remembered him and learned about him, and just trying to see what I could of his work. And I went to see this loft space, which at the time was being lived in by an artist. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's basically this small building that you see here. It's the top part of this. This is an old, first probably a horse and buggy shed, but then it became a carriage house, and eventually, because it was attached to a mortuary, with the beginning of which you can see here, an old Gilded Age home, beautiful large home, it became where they kept the hearses, the down below. But up above here, where the hay had once been stored for the animals, was an empty space, and the patron of the artist, Grant Wood, gave it to Grant Wood to use as a workspace, and eventually, not very long thereafter, he decided it would be not only a workspace for him, he was very, very poor really, and was always trying to put together a living, not selling that much painting and not selling his paintings for much money. He was doing all kinds of craft projects around town, architecture projects. He was also a teacher, and he did a number of commissioned mural works and so on to paste together some kind of annual income. In any case, when he got this opportunity to turn this into not only a space for himself, but also his mother, with whom he was living, he did it very, very creatively. And this is the way it more or less looks today. And this is how it looked in his lifetime, which I know that Sean Ulmer, who's here, the director of the Cedar Rapids Museum, owns this wonderful structure. And someday they're hoping to get more of the texture and the color back of the original building. They have color samples and so on. They'll be able to do that. But this gives you a sense of what it looks like in its lived-in stage. So today we would call this loft living. Lots of built-ins. Was under, I think, 1,000 square feet. Is that right, Sean? And it was really, what you learn in it is how creative and clever the artist was, sort of making it like a yacht or a houseboat, you know. Everything had to have its place. And he filled it with light. He pushed out some windows. He had an ingenious fireplace with a half a bushel basket that he used for the hood. He had back here, under these eaves, there were places to, no, excuse me. Actually, I don't have it. Yeah, it is here, isn't it? Actually, this picture is better. The one that I had just earlier, you can see it. So back in here, he could push beds back during the day to clean up this space, because this had to be his workspace. In fact, these paintings, the reproductions here, are in the space where he would paint. And even these are roll-out areas where he could store his canvases and so on. Well, what interested me in learning about this is that how much insight it gave me into a painting like American Gothic. Because I had known nothing, no one had written really very much about this man's interest in architecture, his great sense of design, and I learned so much in studying the studio about how interested he wasn't as an architect. He was an amateur architect really, but he did do a lot of design around town as well as his own space. And he had been trained in the arts and crafts movement. But that helped me understand, for instance, how he came upon this little house, recognized its sort of late Victorian neo-Gothic window, loved the board and batten style of it, and this house is what started the whole idea of a couple in front of it. We won't go there tonight, but the point is that I could go from the studio back to the paintings and begin to see an intelligence at work that I hadn't understood in quite the same way. Even the fact that the house is filled with his own metalwork, all of these lanterns he fashioned, and there are light poles here that are done in wrought metal. He was, as I say, trained as a metal worker. He also made jewelry in the early years. He wasn't going to be a painter necessarily. He was going to be an arts and crafts home decorator, and it just he sort of the movement fell apart after he got going in it, and it wasn't the outlet that he had hoped it might be. Just the very fact that he could be so ingenious in putting together an unpretentious, multi-purpose, multifunctional living space, having no money to work on, he cut corners all the time creatively in doing this, helped me understand even the degree to which he came from the same stock as his hardworking couple with their tidy little homestead behind him. Well, something similar, that is, I could bring my study, my understanding of the what I could learn in an artist home and studios, to begin to see things in the paintings I wasn't going to see in quite the same way. Something similar happened when I started to work on Georgia O'Keeffe. And this also was in the 1980s. I turned to studying Georgia O'Keeffe's New Mexican paintings. And in the earlier years, 60s and 70s, it had been primarily her flower paintings that had captured the imagination of scholars. So to start looking at some of the work that she did in New Mexico was another way, and also her long career in New Mexico, was looking at a piece of her career that hadn't been looked at before. And I was writing a book called The Great American Thing, and trying to move the conversation to place. Excuse me. I've had a cold. I was hoping I could, pretend I didn't, but it's catching up with me. And I was working with paintings like this that are extremely colorful, and I just underline that because it'll make sense in a moment as to why she is so often thought to be probably the greatest colorist as a modernist of her generation that come out of the New York circle of painters around Stieglitz that she belonged to. In any case, in order to do this right, I paid a call. I mean, you had to do a lot of back work to get an appointment with Miss O'Keeffe, but I did do the back work, and I was able to go visit her in 1980, and I went to her home. She had has two homes in northern New Mexico. Both of them are about 60 miles from Santa Fe, slightly north and west, and the bigger of the two of them, where she could have a garden and where she could live comfortably during the winter months, is the home at Abiquiu, and we have good representation here from this site. You can go to this house on a regular basis. It's open to the public, and an important part of O'Keeffe's story is told through it. In any case, when I went and I approached exactly on this dusty road that you see here, parked and went in through that door, and went into this studio. Now, this is what the studio looked like in her lifetime, and it has this extraordinary 1950s picture window. You can't think of anything more modern than these windows that she's punctured through the more traditional adobe building. She actually took the ruins of a hacienda, a large spread, that had been there for even centuries, and redesigned it for her own needs, and created one piece of it which also had been a stable, as a studio for herself, to which she attached her private bedroom and bathroom. So if guests came and she wasn't interested in them, she could retreat to the studio and to bed, and she had her own kind of almost like mother-in-law apartment attached to her larger house. In any case, when I came into this space, it did look very close to this because she was no longer painting. She had macular degeneration and had to give up her studio practice, and there was a small bed in the space because she would both nap there, daytime napping, but also a caretaker would spend the night. So this is exactly the kind of way it looked when I was there, and all that I can remember was how spare it was, how white it was. I was partially not remembering much more because I was slightly terrified that I wouldn't get my questions asked, and I didn't know quite what her demeanor might be. It all went extremely well. But the point being is that when I went into the studio, I was sort of struck by its austerity and its emptiness. And you can't help but be struck by the modernity of the Barrois lounger, the mid-20th century furniture that you have around the Eros Saarinen tulip. There's a tulip chair with a table that matches it, and the Bertoia bird chair and stool that you see there, and how they're placed almost like pieces of sculpture, separated out from one another, and they sit with a kind of dignity and kind of aloneness in these large empty spaces. Well, that became much more a lesson for me when I got to know the rest of the house much better, which I did after she died 6 years later. She died in her 98th year in 1986. And this is her sitting room at various times. And actually, this picture, this picture I think is more to her taste and her way of setting things up. And this one next, but this one has been a little gussied up for a particular assignment that somebody had to do photographs for an article about her home and studio, and it's also compressed. There's a funny angle there. But my point would be this, that in going to see her living spaces, she called this her sitting room, I was always struck that it looked like it was a sitting room for one. And that was usually because there was one beautiful chair sitting someplace, either looking out again into her gardens and this beautiful old ancient tree, or next to a fireplace in a kind of cozier way. But once again, it was the placement of furniture, and we do know this is how she was placing it at the end of her life, and we have lots of pictures that show it along the way. She certainly changed her mind over the years. But eventually, this kind of quiet, space with these punctuated by these beautiful modern chairs or rug, very simply decorated, if decorated at all. At most you would have 2 paintings, as you have here in this particular picture, but no clutter. You would never see a tchotchke. You would never see a photograph of a human being, like a snapshot, let's say. There'd be nothing in a frame such as that. And even though she was a wonderful collector of natural goods and sometimes would sort of bundle them up in her outdoor spaces, in her indoor spaces, they're very often beautifully arranged in still lifes. She collected both bones, bleached bones, for which she's famous, but she also loved these very smooth, water-smoothed rocks that she would find on her walks and her travels. In other words, when you see these spaces, you think of a modernist space. These are the understated, less is more ethos that she is relishing and putting into practice. And one other observation that I made at the time was that whenever you saw photographs of her in her space, such as the one on the left, she always seemed to be so put together, usually wearing something black, often robe-like, or a black suit that seemed just right in her adobe surroundings. It wasn't ethnic dress, but their garments, black garments that are pulled tight like this wrap dress here, that paid or nodded to, let's say, Hispanic women's shawls, black shawls, or nuns' robes, that when nuns were in the desert, and often they came calling, or they were in churches that were up in these dusty desert settings, or even the blankets the Pueblo Native Americans would wrap themselves in. And I couldn't help but say, I don't know, I've always had this thing about artists who have signature dress styles. What is it all about? I've wondered about that. And so there's Grant Wood, my other artist, and his signature style. He too was a regionalist, but how different from Miss O'Keeffe, in that his was the bibbed overalls that he took from not only farmer culture in the Midwest, but even more so, it's what industrial laborers would wear in factories such as the Quaker Oats factory that's in Cedar Rapids. But I always point out that he was a man with great style. He always, and not always, but very often would put two-tone shoes and a starched white shirt to go along with this more rustic outfit. Well, I show you these two as a segue then to how I got to the clothes. Because after I'd written The Great American Thing, I had barely been able to mention, but I did mention, the uniformity of her taste in her home, in the case of the chapter on Georgia O'Keeffe. I mentioned a little bit about her clothes, but not enough to sort of satisfy me. And I should say that The Great American Thing is about 8 or 9 different artists, and each one gets a chapter. And I had been fascinated by the fact that some of my members of the modernist crew that I was looking at had very interesting domestic spaces, O'Keeffe being, of course, one of them. And some of them, their domestic spaces weren't anything you wanted to necessarily write home about. So I began to think, why do some early 20th century modernists work so hard at creating homes? And very often, such in these two instances, those same two people also designed signature styles of dress. And in search of a new project, after doing a big book like that, you don't quite know where you're going to turn next. And I thought, well, I'm going to start and I'm going to just try to tackle this problem about whether there's a certain almost anthropological modernist type that would spend time on their home and on their clothes. And could we say something more about where that idea came from? Why artists were particularly good, some artists particularly good at it, and some didn't matter at all. And I began to shop around a lecture called Dressing Modern, Artists and Their Clothes. And I should say, for the benefit of our British colleagues, that lecture began with the Pre-Raphaelites and with Whistler and Oscar Wilde, and then it ran all the way up to Grant Wood. Well, having given this lecture in Santa Fe, I learned totally by accident, because the lecture I was using, I should say, as my source material photographs, what artists wore in photographs that were popularly and easily available. I had never seen a piece of clothing, actual clothing, that any of my artists in this lecture that had been preserved. What I learned was that the O'Keeffe Museum, that had recently come into ownership of the big house as well as the small house called Ghost Ranch, that all the closets in those homes were filled with clothes in garment bags. And they were slowly being transferred from those two houses to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, a one-artist museum. And they were straightening them out and trying to get them better taken care of and put into museum conditions. That was in 2001. Well, I never got around to, I did go enough to see that there was a lot of work to be done, and that there just might be very interesting story and something to learn. But I didn't get there until 2013. It took me a while. And what I discovered was an enormous archive, of which I'll just let this picture will just be a generic picture of trying to make snapshots of every single garment, because nothing was in any order. We had no dates for anything. Some things would have a label or a brand name. Some of the boots would even have good dirt from her walking around. She did walks regularly every day, even as she aged. And we spent, it wasn't just me, it was me and a curator at the museum. And I had to hire a research assistant because I got way out of my depth in that I'm not a textile and fashion person. And we made, slowly but surely, we made order out of chaos. It was a lot of detective work. There was so much to look at and so much to understand. One thing we had to understand is, why did O'Keeffe keep so many clothes? And why did she keep clothes that we could date with the help of research back to the 1920s? This is now, I'm looking in 2013. They were in her closets when she died in 86. So she had kept them for 60 years, and she had moved them from one house to another over the course of that time. Well, one answer is, and here you're going to see the best of them, is that they were beautiful. Some of them, not all of them. We didn't put all of them in the exhibition, but we had about 74 garments in the exhibition. They were beautiful in their design. They were made of the finest wools, cottons, and silks, and they had beautiful workmanship. But the other answer that I, as a historian, uncovered, and this was perhaps the most thrilling, is that once we started to really look closely at the stitching and look closely at the design of them and the uniformity of the design, I was able to determine that she was the seamstress for many of the early pieces, such as all these white tunics and second pieces, usually a little jacket. And she was also I make this attribution, she also made this evening coat as well. Well, that would help explain why she kept some of these things. The labor intensity involved in them would have made it very difficult. And we know that she did give away some of her clothes at the later part of her career. But it helps to know that she made these so that they would be very, very precious to her. And we were able to determine that the later garments, such as the cape that you see here, this is a cape and this is a two-piece suit. This is one of the first suits of the 1940s in black that she has as a silk suit, were if not store-bought, they were seamstress and tailor-made, because the labels would alert us to that. Most of the best pieces were bespoke garments that she had a hand in commissioning, designing, and I learned from talking to 3 of her seamstresses, she invariably chose the fabric or had to approve it before she would have something made in it. And the more we looked and sorted it out, the more we found a kind of intelligence and consistency to the clothes that were remarkable. For instance, and I show you these black and white elements, just thinking of the style, how might we just quickly characterize it? One is silhouette mattered to her. Silhouette rather than anything workings internally, so that these all, when you see them against white walls, as you see here, all of these sort of stand out for, if you will, the bulk or the outline of a moving, sinuous, soft silhouette. And if you think, well, that's the kind of painter she was, I think you're right on. Flowing lines, not squared off so much as lines that go softly over the torso. No ornamentation. Solid colors with an emphasis, there's no doubt about it, on black and white. Occasionally a pattern, stripes or plaids, but nothing beyond that. And always the finest of fabrics. People ask me how the clothes were kept, because they're in such excellent condition, and I have to say they've been in garment bags in Santa Fe for years. And we're just lucky that that the air there and the conditions have kept these clothes in superb condition. There were great lessons here for me as an art historian, and I, just as I had done with Grant Wood, began to see things in her paintings that I had never seen before. For example, it is true that black and white dominated the wardrobe, but not exclusively, as I'll mention in a minute. And here she was, known as such a colorist. And then I began to realize, as I flipped through the Catalogue Raisonné one day, that she could, in fact, do a lot of paintings in just black and white, or maybe with a little bit of blue or a little bit of yellow. But no one has ever, someday, believe me, somebody will do a show of Georgia O'Keeffe in black and white. And we'll have a much better sense of how she would take those two colors and use it as a particular palette, particularly in the 1920s. I think it's really an experiment of that decade and doesn't continue much later on. But she's using the same palette in her art as she did in her dress. Furthermore, when we began to install paintings like these next to her paintings, we discovered what you might call the clothness of her early abstractions. And if you look at these and you just think, if doesn't this look like kind of balled up cloth? Or don't we have seams, seam-like structures, textures, folds, the sheerness that you get, for instance, and transparency. And she loved sheer silks in particular. And if we go back to look at a picture like this one, here, where you see this is the first iteration of these tunics against these black and white paintings. We put 3 of them in a row here. We had a revelation that the love of fabric was also, one could say, a love that she brought when she was deciding upon the textures and the forms of her painting. That, I have to say, you will not find in the book that accompanied this, because I had not realized it. It was one of those wonderful discoveries you make when you suddenly have the opportunity to put things together as we see here. Now we make a big point of it. We're in venue 5 and we do a black and white section and make a major point about the palette of clothes is also the palette of some of her paintings. And it also worked the other way. For instance, O'Keeffe is well known for her seriality. That is, and this is true of other early 20th century modernists, whether it's Matisse or Mondrian, where you would take a motif and you would work it in several renditions. In this case, the blue clouds and land watercolors that are probably started by something that had she saw in nature, either clouds or trees, keeping the same blue palette, and then getting simpler as she went further into her investigation. Or similarly with a Jack in the Pulpit series that she did in 1930. Well, this has been very well known, but we were shocked as we began to sort out the collection, the degree to which you could say seriality also ruled the wardrobe. For instance, when she found a dress, she was very practical. When she found a dress she liked, she would simply take it to a seamstress and say, make me another one. And she was, even if the dress had been made by a designer like Claire McCardle, she would shamelessly have it copied. So I kind of forget, but I think the white one is the original one here, and this is exactly like it with pockets that are on the diagonal and make this kind of an interesting style. These are sleeveless dresses because she's wearing these in the desert and it's very hot in the summer. She liked pockets, so any dress that she copied almost invariably always had pockets. And then when she'd find a pair of shoes that she liked, she wouldn't buy just one pair, she'd end up with 6 to 10 pairs. And we saw this repeated over and over again. Here we're taking what we learned from painting and we're bringing it to the investigation of clothes. And that reaches a kind of apex of extreme in the so-called wrap dress, which she's wearing in all 4 of these examples, which is basically a robe made out of cotton. It has no buttons, it has no zippers. She also loved to dispense with any of those kinds of things that made it difficult to get in and out of clothes. And she could wrap this around her, throw a belt around it. She could wear one on top of the other. That's not a white collar, that's really another dress. She either has a white blouse on there or she has another white wrap dress that she's layering here. And put a belt around it, and then she would get them in colors, and the more we looked, the more we found, and I think we're up to about 26 wrap dresses that were in her wardrobe. About 6 or 8 of them were in black, because that's what she wore the most often, but the others come in other colors and even in other fabrics. There's at least one in velvet and one in silk. Now, something that might surprise you with all this color explosion here is the fact that we did find color in our archive. And that was a surprise to all of us to find quite as much as we did, such as I give you 4 examples here. She loved red, usually red in very small places, sort of a detail, accent red, as you see in this beautiful coat that she had made for herself in Hong Kong. This is an interesting plaid, a Madras plaid, that maybe she bought when she traveled. She would buy fabric, and she may have bought this in India. Well, why were we surprised by color? Because she is such a beautiful colorist as a painter. Well, the reason we were surprised, of course, and you've probably thought of this, is that every time we've seen Georgia O'Keeffe without knowing the clothes, she's always wearing black. She wore black for every photographer that she sat for, and she sat for over 50 photographers over her lifetime. Now, she did sit primarily for black and white photographers, so maybe some of those dark colors could have been a different color. But by and large, I have discovered that she is wearing black suits or black dresses or sometimes a black pantsuit, and will use white as an accent color. And this all begins with Stieglitz, who was the first, her husband, to start photographing her, and then it continues Halsman, Karsh, Dan Budnick, and Mary something or other from Los Angeles that came out late in life to photograph her. What became very clear to me is because I first started to use photographs as indexes to the clothes. I thought I could learn dates, for instance. Well, she would wear some things for 30 years, so that didn't help. But secondly, she would wear only black, so the rest of the wardrobe was useless to try to use photographs to help understand the rest of the wardrobe. But what it did give me a chance to think about is how self-consciously, how carefully she chose and styled herself whenever a photographer was around. In other words, she had an enormous degree of agency that she asserted when she prepared herself for photographers, and that was verified by photographers I spoke with. When I talked with Dan Budnick, for instance, when he told her he wanted to photograph her that day, he had come and they were friends, and he wasn't thinking of photographing her, and she disappeared. She was in a house everyday dress, probably one of those color dresses, and she disappeared and came back with this very dapper pantsuit on, including even a little handkerchief in her pocket. They also told me what a great model she was, how comfortable she was in front of the camera. Stieglitz had trained her well that way, and that she enjoyed modeling more than I think we have understood before this exercise. So these are some of the ways that the study of an artist's clothes a study that began first with her homes, expanded our understanding of someone that we thought we already knew. Georgia, in fact, I argue, dressed like she painted, highly valuing abstraction, simplicity, and seriality. She designed, we could say, her body, her homes, her canvases, and her sculptures using a unitary aesthetic that she applied to every decision she made. As the critic Barbara Rose rightly put it, O'Keeffe seems to have been born modern. Simplicity was always her natural idiom, reticence and directness her normal means of expression. We might even go so far to say that O'Keeffe's self-fashioning, and we could add designing and furnishing of her homes, were two of her art forms, and dressing and modeling for the camera was yet another. She was, I would say, a complete and uncompromising 20th century modern. And I call my book Living Modern, O'Keeffe, Living Modern. In this book, I trace O'Keeffe's fluid integration of life and art to the progressive arts and crafts movement, whose philosophy she absorbed as a young woman during the 1910s, primarily through her teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow. But like arts and crafters, she applied one aesthetic to every aspect of her life, whether it was painting, dressing, or arranging chairs in her living room. Her favorite motto, and she would say this all the time, what I do is fill space in a beautiful way. And she could say that about putting a stamp on an envelope, arranging things on a mantelpiece, or forms on a canvas. And how close that is to William Morris's, for instance, have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. O'Keeffe could also have said, as Morris did, quote, the true secret of happiness lies in taking a genuine interest in all the details of daily life. Photographers like Tony Vaccaro were often the most sensitive to O'Keeffe's holistic philosophy. They intuited the synergy between how she looked and how she painted. And when they looked through their lens, they composed their portraits to underline this integrated aesthetic. In this rare composition in color photography, by taking one of her easels out of doors, along with a completed painting, Vaccaro drew a relationship between her art, her arid landscape, and her wrapped body. 20 years later, George Mobley, a staff photographer for National Geographic, did something similar, but this time inside her Ghost Ranch house that was so spare and white-walled it looked like an art gallery. In fact, I had to call him to ask about this because I could not figure out where this photograph was taken. And I loved the composition of it because once again, he seemed to intuit that her profile and clothed body repeated the shapes in the painting to the right. Even the way O'Keeffe angles her cane echoes the gray zigzagging ravine that cuts down the middle of the painting. There's such perfection here in visualizing a symbiosis between O'Keeffe's body and painting that when I asked Mobley, he was living in the mountains in Panama, so this was an ask over email, how he got the shot and where did he find such an uncluttered wall. He told me that he was taking shots for a National Geographic book on the Southwest, American Southwest. He was assigned to photograph O'Keeffe, and she had agreed to let him visit her at the Ghost Ranch, and they had coffee together. And as they spoke, he was so impressed by, quote, the stark graphics of the view in her living room. So all I did was quickly take a few photographs. That's all there was to it. He wasn't there long, but long enough to sense the connective tissue between her painting, her dress, and her minimally decorated home. I'll end with this last portrait ever taken of O'Keeffe. This one's by Bruce Weber. Weber had photographed her earlier, a couple of years earlier. She's 96 years old in this photograph, and he was not meant to photograph her that day. He was on another assignment nearby. But somehow, he got her to dress herself up and pose for him. Her outfit, if you think about it, is priceless. She's wearing one of her male kimonos. I haven't talked about kimonos because she's usually not photographed in them. This is completely unlike her because she wore them as intimate wear around the house, bath wear and bedroom wear. But she went into her closet. She had a couple of dozen kimonos that she collected over the years, and put on this big, heavy male kimono, putting it over a light white cotton kimono, her pin by Alexander Calder, and her beat-up felt vaquero hat. That beat-up hat's in the show. Looks exactly like this. I used to think she had many hats like this because she wears them so often, but I've decided she had one and she wore it for 50 years. He had her stand in front of a giant version of her spiral sculpture in a way that frames the soft lines of her upper torso. She looks away from the camera, a kind of androgynous Buddha-like figure. Everything in the composition is congruent. Everything flows. She's one with the sculpture, and it is one with her. This photograph sums up the harmonious universe that Georgia O'Keeffe built for herself in New Mexico, and her very distinctive way of, quote, filling space in a beautiful way, end quote. Thank you. Thank you. We could have a few quick questions. I know we do want to go to bed. Big day tomorrow. But any queries or things that people would like to comment upon? Doesn't have to be a question necessarily. Yes.
Thank you, Wanda, for such a beautiful presentation, and I just wanted to comment how wonderful and important it is to have this presentation about this artist in terms of her entire life and the clothes that she wore, and everything is part of her artistic, creative life, and also a part of her home and her domestic setting and situation, which is what we're dealing with here in these couple days. And it was just such a great kickoff for the conversations we're going to have. So thank you very much.
I just want to say everything you do matters. Yes, in the back.
I mean, I'd just like to, adding on to that, also the conversation about the role that photography plays for us in our interpretations in our museums and our artists and what we can discover through that, but also its very fascinating kind of role as its own encapsulated thingness that it can be. Just really incredible, and so many inspiring things that come out of what you're saying. It's not really a question. I don't think you'll have very many questions because it's all so good. We just want to talk to you on your own. I'll sit next to you tomorrow.
Well, I will say about photography that it became a much bigger thing than I thought it was going to at the beginning.
Right, and that's really the way your lecture sort of built. I was like, oh, okay. And then that's another conversation.
Yeah, and in fact, I do a very specialized talk on sitting for the photographer, which lets you know how you get this Buddha-like person at the end. That becomes her trope. I mean, that becomes her public identity, is the person who's always, she's never looking at the camera, she's never smiling, she's always in her own world, she's withdrawn. That becomes what she that becomes the way she likes to pose, and she helped. It gets invented by Stieglitz. So
although I have a photograph of O'Keeffe that was taken by an Australian photographer who unfortunately passed away of AIDS and never printed the photos. And one of his friends printed a photo for me, and she's actually looking somewhat at the camera, but as you say, totally encapsulated in her own.
Yeah. And I quickly learned that if I was going to get any information, real information about the clothes, I had to look at snapshots where she was off guard and not dressing for the camera. But if I was going, that helped. But it's harder to find get a hold of the snapshots.
Did she keep albums? Very big albums?
Okay. Albums? Oh. No, that's what ordinary people do. She kept photographs, formal portrait photograph. I think she was very pleased and proud. She's probably the most photographed, now I could say female 20th century artist. I don't even think Frida can come up, I don't think so, because I don't think Frida can get 50 photographers. She can get a lot of pictures, but her father and what's the famous New Yorker that, anyway, she might even be the most photographed American 20th century artist, male or female. I don't know. I mean, Picasso would give her a run for her money, but I'm talking American just to kind of keep my boundaries kind of tight. But I eventually, at the back of my book, I was just driven to do this because if I didn't make sense of how she was dressing for the photographer, I couldn't make sense of a number of issues. So I actually have an appendix where I make a stab at listing every single time she sat for a photographer, because many of them she sat for many times. And I'm over 50. Somebody will redo it one of these days, but at least it's a stab. That's a lot. Well, maybe, and I need to know his name, or her name. I don't know. Okay, Donna.
I wondered if she had any mirrors in her house, because looking at these interiors makes me think that the objects in her house, which she shared and lived with, was reflecting who she was. And I didn't see any particular reflective
Where's my Justina?
surfaces.
Do we have mirrors? I'm going to say only in bathrooms.
There's mirrors in bathrooms. That's it.
That's it, right? That's what I'm remembering too. So, not much. Yeah.
So did you notice any of Stieglitz's stuff? Was there a space for him in her house, or did she collect his photos of her? And did you learn anything about him in your exploration of her environment?
That's a lot of questions. First of all, he never came to the Southwest. So there is the Stieglitz story is a New York story, not a New Mexico story. And when he dies in 46, there was a generation between them. She still had 40 years of life. She left New York at that point and started this adventure I shouldn't say start, continued to go to the Southwest. But their marriage was rocky. And in 29, she decided she needed to carve out a little bit of life for herself. Living in New York with him, and he also had a summer routine where he would go to family property in Lake George. And she could never get any work done there because it really was family property. It was kind of a compound, and so his brothers and their families would all come. There'd be kids running around, and she couldn't get any work done. And she also was asked to manage a lot of doing women's chores, right? Meals, and even though they had help, somebody had to help get the help going and so on. So she loved it at first, but after 10 years of it, it began to wear thin and she wasn't getting any work done. So she left in 29 and went with Rebecca Strand to Taos. That was her first place of entry into New Mexico. And that she loved what she found there so much that she continued to go for the rest of their marriage. So it was an arrangement that suited both of them. So they lived together in the winter and late fall, and they lived apart late spring through the summer. Did I learn much about Stieglitz? Well, I learned a lot because she did not collect his photographs of her, but there is what's called the key set at the National Gallery of Art that she gave to the National Gallery, which has every single photograph that he ever made, the key set. Actually, I shouldn't say every single because there are others that have come along, and there's a catalogue raisonné that you can look at. So I had that as a great guide, the catalogue raisonné. Plus, I did go to the National Gallery on a couple of instances to look at the photographs. And I did learn a great deal about the way in which she learned how to model. I do think I'm the first to sort of think about that. He's always given credit for everything. And I do believe that I think at first he does deserve to get credit because she's just doing what he tells her. You know, put your face this way and look that way and make your hands go like this, look like your paintings. Crude son. So there's a mentoring that goes on, but eventually she begins to fall into poses, and you can just see they have a thing going, and they're not as inventive anymore, and she also tosses off or eliminates ways of posing that she doesn't like anymore, particularly those that really hypergendered her as a female. Anything else? Time for bed? Okay. We'll see. Let's see. We need a review tomorrow? No? Okay. Thank you.